move on and talk through history of the evolution of knowledge in gastrointestinal physiology. Over 1,000 years ago, Moses Maimonides, who was a physician as well as a teacher and philosopher, said man should strive to have his intestines relaxed all the days of his life. So they knew at that time that the intestines do play a role in feeling ill. I think one of the first physiologic investigations occurred in 1822. This was William Beaumont, who was an army physician, and there was a soldier named Alexis St. Martin who was shot, and he developed a gastric fistula. And Beaumont was studying this, and he noted that milk coagulated, which led to the understanding of acid secretion, and that digestion included a churning motion. In the beginning of the 20th century, Walter Cannon noted that cats, when stressed by a growling dog, were shown by X-ray to have reduced intestinal motility. So this was one of the early examples physiologically of motility being affected by stress. Ivan Pavlov, who of course you know about in terms of conditioned response, he also looked at conditioned response relative to gastric secretion. You need a cephalic phase for acid secretion. And what he found is if he severed the vagus nerve, this abolished gastric secretion in response to sham feeding. When animals saw food, they would salivate, but if they had a vagotomy, this ended the acid secretion. Stuart Wolf studied a patient named Tom, who's shown in the background, looking at the role of emotion and stress. Tom, actually at age 9, burned his esophagus with clam chowder, and surgeons at New York Hospital performed one of the first gastrostomies of the time. Tom fed himself through the gastrostomy for the next 65 years of his life. Wolf noted that in stressful situations, there was paleness and reduced motility of the stomach, similar to Cannon's cats. But when the person got angry or challenged, the mucosa became red and there was increased secretion and increased motility, similar to the changes of anticipated food. So emotions of stress or fear or anger would lead to different changes. In the 40s, Hans Selye, who, as you know, looked at the effects of stress, he noted that the adrenal enlargement occurred in rats exposed to stress, but he also noted that there were gastric erosions as part of his concept of the general adaptation syndrome. Tom Almey, another one of my mentors, studied the effects of stress on colonic motility in human subjects. And here's one experiment that wouldn't occur by IRB now. He looked at fourth-year medical students, and he did sigmoidoscopy by having them in the knee-chest position. And he looked at the contractile state of the bowel after an emotional stress, where he was looking at the sigmoid colon, and he found, he said to the student that it looks like there's a cancer, and he actually took a false biopsy, put a piece of potato in a jar of formalin and showed it to the student, and he looked at the increase in motility until the hoax was explained, and then the contractile state improved. As I mentioned, George Engel did some very interesting work with psychologic factors, coining the term biopsychosocial model. And this was one of his famous work. It was a woman named Monica who was born with a gastric esophageal fistula, and she was tube fed. And he took videotapes and recordings of her into her 40s and was able to show the effects of this kind of pattern on her behavior. For example, when she was 6 years old and played with a doll, she wouldn't snuggle the doll to her chest. She would hold it at a distance. And when she had her own baby, she said she would not hold the child to her chest. And when asked why by Engel, she said it didn't feel natural. He then went back to the early life, and you can see that she was not cuddled. She was fed by a tube. So the derivative of that, it led to actual change in personality. And then finally, more recently, is Bill Whitehead, who's been a collaborator of mine for decades at our UNC Center, and he promoted the concept of visceral hypersensitivity. And this was a game changer in the field because it moves us away from motility alone to looking at sensitivity. And this was his study back in 1990 to show that when you did rectal distension in normal people, you had a graded increase in pain reporting. IBS had increase in pain reporting that was far significantly greater than the normal at any given level of distension when controlling for motility effects. As I mentioned, there also was the evidence that people with IBS also had increased motility as well. There was a period of time in the 80s where investigators at many institutions were looking at the answer to the symptoms of pain and nausea by looking at motility. This is the discrete cluster contractions that were thought to be related to IBS as it compared to the normals of the migrating motor complex. However, by the 1990s, it was found that these motility patterns did not really correlate with pain. And the idea of a motility marker for IBS, for example, or pain symptoms was abandoned.